Using that, okay. Okay. No, well. So this is the thing that will put the audio through. Instead of us hearing the echo. If you know how to do it, how to work it, you know how to. He didn't stick around to help set it up. He just delivered it. Well, you have to, but that was the beginning of the video.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. They worked out
Okay.
good.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna turn off my video. Okay.
So.
And I'll put this in present mode.
Should I replace this one with one that doesn't? Collection.
Very tired.
I've been meaning to get a hold of you. I was anyway. Oh, sorry.
Oh, good.
So, I called that I was the electric vehicle station. So I tried to click on the electric vehicle website, but I got nothing.
I need help on, slideshow mode.
There you go. It's up.
Good, good. Wow.
This is not the question. Let me ask the question.
But,
Should we replace this one with one that doesn't?
okay.
Coming down.
Set up, I don't interrupt
Much.
Who's gonna be standing here at the podium most?
Adrian.
He's not gonna like that.
What?
This is a bit low.
Sing won't stay, For your position, it shrinks.
Is this one? But this one doesn't, this one might switch out.
Okay.
I think this must be the grants. What was his name? Arhan.
Okay, well.
Orhan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Have we,
Who's grandson?
okay, tell you what,
Who's
I'm
grandson?
gonna go
Elsewhere,
elsewhere
Grandson.
and I'm gonna sign that.
Okay.
And then let's see if we can project me here.
Okay.
Okay, because we need to be able to project Nathaniel, and he'll be coming on in 6 minutes, but I'd like to have it worked out before he signs.
Okay,
So I think that's the best way to do it.
Well, this is already on Zoom, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, this one here.
That's
So,
Okay.
and so I thought we'd just join, use this one to
That's fine.
join him in. Still, but still, you want to check.
Yeah, I wanna project from the remote place.
Yeah.
See that it can be heard through the speakers.
Okay.
So what are we gonna do now?
We're gonna let him
Do whatever.
meander on and come back with a he'll join in. You see him here and then.
So will you stop my sharing so that he can show his slides? How will that work?
Yeah, we'll just give him sharing
Okay,
ability and then that should be
okay.
enough to
Should be.
make it work, I guess.
To me, the only risk is if he loses internet connection, then he can't dial in and talk, dial in and talk. But he won't see his slides.
Right.
Probably all that happening is slim. He does that, but
Okay, Wake up, we're actually getting our people again.
I know, it's great.
Today, this afternoon,
Yeah.
Marisol.
Yeah, Carol was there and
Yeah.
said there was about 50 people.
Yeah,
51.
yeah, and some people said they would, I've seen lots of people I don't recognize.
Yeah, there's a few people, yeah. The Colonies.
You better make sure you get some red wine before it's all gone.
About a year ago.
Oh, you mean flying around New York?
I'd like to say something.
Hey, Nathaniel.
Hi, how are you,
Hi
Barry?
there. I'm doing well.
But I'm not sure. I'm getting echo. Finally,
I'm not sure that we have things set up. Let me get a little help here. Okay, Nathaniel's here, but I don't know how to get him into the speakers. This is going out here.
How do you
You want to share?
have that interface or?
Have you signed this in?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're. Okay, so you're going to be able to share. So Nathaniel's here. Okay. Now we have this. We don't have this termination. So let me call. I'm gonna call the front desk.
Well, I mean, at worst, we can have him just come through the speaker and put the mic down next to him.
Well, let's try that out. Let's test it out.
That would be a lot. That'd be more understandable. That'd be more understandable.
Yeah, so is this on?
It's
And how do we turn this on? Okay, that's on. Okay, now.
Here's so.
Have speaker here?
It should be on. Yes, it is. Okay. So
This is mine.
okay.
I'm having it come through here.
Oh,
You have it goes with it.
okay. Actually, we just Nate, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes,
Yeah.
he can hear you.
Can you say something, please?
Absolutely. How does this sound coming through?
Okay, now I'm gonna have here. Okay. Try. Okay, Nate, say something else.
Hi, this is Nathaniel. Is this coming through?
Well, I'm hearing him here.
Are you putting my name there? You sure? I don't. Where's the speakers on this one? There. Oh, okay. Yeah, speakers. I'm gonna put this. Okay, let me work on it.
The speaker's all the way up. And we want to turn the microphone.
Okay. Well, let's do a test on Zoom. Let's go back to Zoom. Are any of
So that's the right speaker.
that's right. Okay. 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 Nathaniel, say something again.
All right. How does this sound coming through? Is this a good sound level?
Okay, say some other things.
Hi, this is Nathaniel. I don't know if this sound level is good, but hopefully you can hear me a little bit better.
Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3.
You're testing.
Yeah, we're not getting. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 2. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Oh,
Later they would make me resign.
Yes, for Okay, Nathaniel, let's try it again.
All right. How does this sound? Is this coming through now? Can folks hear me?
Okay, no, not yet. Put up the volume some more.
At some point, I'd like to make an announcement about the signs.
yeah.
Testing 1. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, Nathaniel, let's try it again.
Hi, this is Nathaniel. I don't know if you can hear me, but hopefully this sound level is a little bit better. How is this coming through?
Yours or?
No, it's coming through yours.
Okay.
Mine is coming through my earbuds.
Good. Okay. So,
Okay, Nathaniel, try it again.
Sure. This is Nathaniel trying again. Hopefully this volume level is better than before. How am I coming through?
soft here. The problem is it's
For some reason, it's
it's soft even in this.
okay. Let's try it on this one. Better disconnect from here. You have to block that so we don't get feedback.
Yeah.
Okay. Nathaniel, say something else now.
Sure. How is this? How is this coming through? Can you hear me well? This is Nathaniel. Hopefully this volume level is good. Sure, this is Nathaniel. I see a sideways wine glass, which is really interesting. And up, there we go. How is this volume level?
Try it again.
Hi, this is Nathaniel Stinnett. I hope this volume level is coming through okay and people can hear me.
Okay, we're just trying different computers. Where's your system? So it doesn't do that. I'm trying to. I'm just turning it off right now. Okay. Okay, Nathan, could you say something again?
Sure. Theophilus thistle, the thrifty thistle sifter. Thrust thrice 3,000 thistles through the thick of his thumb. How does that sound?
Haven't heard that in a long time. I'm impressed. Okay, do it. Try again.
Hi, this is Nathaniel Stinnett. I hope you can hear my voice coming through okay now. I hope this is a good volume level that everyone can hear.
Not quite. I think this one was loudest.
Turn this one off.
Turn this one back on. It's hot. Okay, one more time, Nathan.
Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table.
We shot on the speaker, let alone speak.
Yeah.
That's the fan. She can be right here.
I know. You're gonna get that well. Well, you know what? Let's use the phone. Let's use our phone. Where did I put my phone? Okay. I have a good speaker on. Let me get my phone. Okay. Let's try here. You should share it. I enjoyed your speaker. Maybe you enjoy. Where do you plug it into the house? Well, I put it in this. Oh, we don't have a. Let's have you. Here. I can read this up to March, and we can come in some of those other stuff. Sure, we got a little more of those. So, Nathaniel Harvard. Okay, Nathaniel, can you hear me, Nathaniel?
I can, yes.
Okay, so what I'd like you to do is call my phone number. And you mute yourself, but we're going to have a phone call to me, and I'm going to put you on speakerphone, and then we'll magnify that.
All right. What is your phone number?
Phone number is 215-285-0854.
All right. I will give you a call right now.
Okay, and I'm gonna get off of Zoom from my phone. Okay, hear you soon.
This was a good turnout.
I close this.
I feel it. Thank you. I read a quick thing, you just in case I was feeling.
Hi. Okay, now let's relax microphones. The speaker. Okay, now try it. Try saying something. Hi, this is Grist. Hi. Can you hear me now? This is a great phone. Okay, I think this is the best we're gonna do, and I think it's probably gonna be good enough, but we have to quiet the audience here. So just be patient with us. Oh, yes. Okay, let's make Nathaniel a phone. Okay, why don't you call the meeting to?
Okay.
And yes, go ahead. And when to get him to talk, then you'll have to put this in there. Okay.
Should I put on the email?
Oh, I put it in your mouth. I think you're gonna need to.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Testing. You hear me? Okay.
Just, yeah, you're only on a box. So if you press it, no.
Okay.
Everybody, we're going to call the meeting to order. If everyone could please take a seat. It's so great to have so many new faces here this evening. It's great to be in person and in this room. This is where we're going to have to meet the rest of the last year, always keep up. Back here so that we can have a social life. My name is Casey. I'm the president of this year. Barry's going to start the recording. I'm getting a lot of feedback here.
Yeah,
from
you are.
here. We're gonna have a couple of fun facts. Oh, no, first we're gonna have the room and Zoom ground rules. So.
We gotta fix the echo.
Okay. Okay, so we do have a couple of people on Zoom, and particularly our main speaker for tonight is going to be joining us from Boston. In the room, please wait and use a microphone. We are recording this on Zoom so that we can have this for the future and other people can listen to it. And Zoomers, we ask that you mute yourself when you're not speaking, and raise your hand electronically if you would like to participate in the Q&A. What's that mean?
Silence the cell phones.
Oh, silence the cell phones. This article was sent to me by Margot this week. It's from the Environmental Protection Agency, and I thought it was a rather startling statistic that we throw out 292.4 million tons of trash each year, and 146.1 million goes to landfill. This jacket I'm wearing tonight did not go to landfill. I went to Savers and came home with me.
And it's a great jacket.
Oh, so too. Thank you. I'm gonna call Adrian up to talk about the electric driverless shuttles, whether they're coming or not.
Yeah, you'll be all required to use one of these on the way home tonight. Apparently, in 2018, the GRF engaged with to do a transportation study. Oops.
Sorry.
Okay.
I want to.
Anyway, so they engaged with the California, Contra Costa County Transit Authority, CCCT. Yeah, to do a transit study in Rossmore. And part of that, and one of the results of that was that it would be a good idea or an interesting idea to have autonomous vehicles as for us here. And so they actually entered into some sort of an agreement back in 2018 to do that, but it took a while before it actually started to show up. And so these particular shuttles have been running down at Bishop Ranch, down near San Ramon. And apparently there's talk about having them come here and actually run for a while between Gateway and the fitness center, I believe, is the intent, and try that out for a while and see whether that makes sense for something for us to do here at Rossmore. And I know a number of us are quite enthusiastic about this happening, so that'd be great.
Is it gonna happen?
Well, it is got, I think the trial will happen in maybe October or November or something like that.
Europe.
Oh, my, okay. Okay, let's talk about money. Yes. We received about $500 in memberships. We spent about $900. Most of that went to, we pay for the room, these rooms that we use, we pay for that for the whole year. That's where most of that money went. So we're up to about $7,100 in the bank this time. And then membership, 129 have renewed for this year. 6 people have joined already this year. 26 of the people who joined last year have renewed, and 97 people who joined before 2023 have renewed. So that's really kind of encouraging. But 46 people who were active last year have not renewed. So anyway, but if you're here and aren't already a member, it's easy to join. Next slide. Just go to our website, click on join us, and you can pay by credit card, or you can leave a check in our box at Gate. Okay.
Okay.
It's a great pleasure. I'm Barry Bryan, by the way. I am now your secretary of Sustainable Rossmore. We like to trade off leadership positions so nobody gets too power hungry. I was gonna say elections stuff now. I'm not gonna go there. Okay, let me just pull up my introduction, which so our speaker, Nathaniel Stinnett, is Stinnett, he'll correct me when he comes on, is the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. Nathaniel founded the Environmental Voter Project in 2015 after a decade of experience as a senior advisor, consultant, and trainer for political campaigns and issue advocacy nonprofits. Hailed as a visionary by the New York Times and dubbed the voting guru by Grist magazine, Stinnett is a frequent expert speaker on cutting-edge campaign techniques and the behavioral science behind getting people to vote. He has held a variety of senior leadership positions and campaign manager positions on U.S. Senate, Congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns, and he sits on the board of advisors of MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. Formerly an attorney at the international law firm DLA Piper LLP, Stinnett holds a BA from Yale University and a JD from Boston College Law School. He lives in Boston, and that's all I took a snapshot of. So I'll leave it there, and now I'll put my speaker on, and we are going to hope that we can hear him adequately. We kind of thought we could hear him. Let me put that here, and let's do another test. Nathaniel, go ahead.
All right, Barry. How does that sound? Can people hear me in the room there?
Yeah, I'm getting thumbs up. So please go ahead now. So we're going to have you. You can do a new share of your slides.
Great. I will go ahead and do that. Here we go. Okay. How about that technology? We can be heard, we can be seen. Everything is working well here. So thank you, Barry. I'm just so grateful for the invitation to speak to all of you. Barry, I'm so grateful for your support of our work at the Environmental Voter Project over the years. And I'm grateful to you, Amanda, for your leadership at Sustainable Rossmore. And I'm grateful to so many of you who have been involved as volunteers or donors in our work. Really, thank you so much. We run on donations and volunteer work. And as I hope to show you over the next few minutes, your time and effort and support has made an extraordinary impact. So just thank you all. And I'm asking your forgiveness ahead of time because I'm going to thank you a bunch more times over the next 30 minutes, okay? So I always like to sort of provide a table of contents so people know what's coming. I'm going to start by describing what we do with the Environmental Voter Project, this nonprofit I run, and why we do it. Then I'm going to get into our methods, or how we do it. Then I'm going to get into some of our results, our voter turnout results. And then perhaps most importantly are the last two things. We're going to get into opportunities for you to have an impact. I'm not sure if you've heard, but there are some big elections going on this year. And for people who care about sustainability and addressing the climate crisis and dealing with elections and the democracy crisis, the next 9 months or the next 9 months minus 1 day are going to be crucially important. And we've got a lot of opportunities for you to get involved. And then finally, we will have a Q&A session. So I'm really, really excited for this discussion. And I just want to go ahead and jump right into things. So let's start with what the Environmental Voter Project does and why we do it. In a nutshell, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on what you see right here on this slide. We identify people who care about the environment yet don't vote, and then we turn them into better, more consistent voters. That's it. That's what we do. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. And as I hope to show you over the next few minutes, that might sound like a very narrow niche, but unfortunately, it's not as narrow as you might want it to be. But before we get into that, I just want to be clear. When I say we focus on finding environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into better voters, what that also means is we don't do a lot of the things that you probably typically imagine an environmental nonprofit doing. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. As odd as it might sound, we don't even try to convince people to care more about climate change or clean air or clean water or other environmental issues. In fact, probably the best way to get a handle on what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is to understand that we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we're solely in the behavior-changing business. What we try to do with the Environmental Voter Project is identify the people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They care so deeply about climate or the environment that it's their #1 priority. But they're not voting. And so what they need is their behavior changed. And as I hope to show to you, that creates a lot of efficiencies because that approach enables us to bypass the hardest, messiest stuff of politics, which is changing people's opinions and changing their minds, and instead going to people who just need their behavior changed. All right. Why do we have this narrow focus? Well, one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest reason, is what you see on this poll. Now, this poll is obviously one of a million polls. But I promise you, what this shows is no different from any other poll of likely voters taken at any time over the last 10 years for any election. Now, this particular poll happens to be of likely voters in the most recent midterm election. So it was taken in battleground states, and these likely voters were asked, what are your top 3 political priorities? 15% listed climate and the environment. Now, the good news is that's a lot more than we would have seen maybe 4 years previous to this in 2018 or back in 2014. That 15 number is higher than we're used to. But the bad news is it is not nearly enough to get politicians to really pay attention to climate and environmental issues. Because I know it might not always feel this way, but campaigns actually have a limited amount of money, and they certainly have a limited amount of time, and they need to pick and choose what to spend their political capital on and what to spend their bandwidth into your ears and your brains and your TVs and your computers on. And it's really hard to justify spending serious time and energy talking about the thing that only 15% of likely voters list as a top 3 priority. And this lack of demand in the political marketplace for climate leadership has enormous ramifications. But before we get into the ramifications, let me just say, this same poll also measured what people's #1 priority was. So what you're looking at here is the top 3 priorities. You drill down to #1 and look, only 4% of likely voters in battleground states back in the 22 midterms listed climate and the environment as their top priority. And again, I promise you, I'm not cherry picking polls here. You look at any polls of likely voters for things from president all the way down to dog catcher, and you're going to see numbers like this. And I think it is crucially important for those of us who care deeply about climate and environmental issues to recognize this problem. We do not have enough political power right now. We don't have enough political power. Because when politicians decide what to spend their time and energy on, boy, is it hard to expect them to go out on a limb and spend their time and energy on the thing that 4% of voters list as their top priority. Now, I want to be clear. Some of you are probably thinking, well, wait a second, Nathaniel, like I've seen polls showing like majorities of Americans support government action on climate change and 70% support clean energy and things like that. Yes, that's true. That's true. But I think it's really important for us to understand the difference between voter preferences and voter priorities. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of Americans, thankfully, who would prefer government leadership addressing the climate crisis. But that doesn't mean it's an important or salient issue to them. For many people, it's a pretty unimportant preference. And that makes a big difference to a politician, right? Like let's use a different example. Let's say 80% of Americans want to get rid of daylight savings time. Well, does that mean that the next presidential election is going to be decided on the issue of whether to get rid of daylight savings time? No, of course not. That's not a very salient issue. That's not an important issue to many voters. And unfortunately, you can almost say the same thing about the climate crisis. Very, very few voters list climate and the environment as their top priority. I promise this isn't all going to be a doom and gloom presentation. I've got a lot of good news for you, but I believe in trying to recognize and be honest about these important problems that we face. And this is a particularly important problem because not only is this a barrier to us electing the so-called right people, to electing climate leaders, but even when we do elect good climate leaders, it isn't like they can just snap their fingers and get whatever they want passed, right? No, even when we elect the so-called right people, they still need to figure out what to spend their precious political capital on. And I'm sorry, we can never expect a politician to have so much courage as to say, you know what, I'm going to spend all my political capital on the thing that's 11th on the list of voter priorities and only 4% listed as their top issue priority. Man, that's a lot to ask. And this is particularly problematic because of this. And I know this is a weird, kind of boring looking slide, but I swear to you, it is probably the most important concept that I'm going to talk about this evening. Whether you vote or not is public record. Everybody get that? I'm going to say it again in case you missed it. Whether you vote or not is public record. Now, who you vote for, that's secret. I think we all know that. But whether you vote or not is public record. And here's why that's important. Let's say Barry is running for governor of California. Okay, everybody, Barry's, yeah, woohoo! Barry's running for governor of California. For better or for worse, he's hired me as his campaign manager, though. So I don't get your hopes up here. But I'm going to walk you through what the first meeting is on pretty much any political campaign, okay? We're going to go into a room in the Barry for Governor campaign, and we're going to open up our laptops and look at these public voter files. Remember the concept that I just told you, whether you vote or not is public record. And so on the Barry for Governor campaign, we're going to open up our laptops, we're going to look at public voter files, and we're going to make the most important decision that any political campaign ever makes. And that is this: who are we going to talk to and who are we not going to talk to? Because Barry, like any candidate, doesn't have unlimited money and doesn't have unlimited time. And he's trying to win a majority of voters, not non-voters. So we need to make a very important decision. Who are we going to talk to with Barry's limited time and limited money? And we're literally looking at a list of public voter files showing who votes and who doesn't in particular elections. And so we've got one group of Californians over here who aren't even registered to vote. Probably not going to talk to them. Oh, here's a list over here. Oh yeah, this group, they are registered to vote, but it looks like they've never cast a ballot in any election. Barry, we're probably not going to talk to them either. Oh, here's a group over here. Yeah, they do vote, but only in presidential elections. We'll probably skip them too. Oh, here, these ones do vote in gubernatorial elections. Yeah, let's definitely talk to them. Oh, and here's a group over here who vote in local elections too. Well, let's definitely talk to them. And not to put too fine a point on it, but we literally know these people by name and street address. And I know that sounds creepy, but this is how political campaigns are run. It's how they've been run for over 30 years. Campaigns decide whom to target and whom not to target by looking at people's public voting histories and figuring out, okay, who votes in the election that I'm trying to win? And so ultimately what that means, to get to this slide, is that campaigns usually only target likely voters. Now, sometimes when they have an abundance of cash or an abundance of time, they'll start talking to less likely voters. But that's only if they have that abundance of cash and abundance of time. And so if campaigns mostly target likely voters, well, who do you think they poll? They sure as heck don't poll the people for whom they have public records showing that they never actually cast ballots. No, campaigns only poll likely voters too. And that's why polls like this that I just showed to you are so important, yet also kind of bad news for the environmental movement. Because when you look at voters, people who actually show up and cast ballots in the elections that politicians are trying to win, very, very few of them list climate or the environment as their top priority. All right, I told you this wasn't going to be all doom and gloom. Now we get to some of the better stuff. What we realized at the Environmental Voter Project was the reason so few voters list climate and the environment as a top priority is not because too few Americans do. Let me say that again. The reason so few voters list climate and the environment as a top priority is not because too few Americans do. In fact, if you broaden the aperture, if you step back and you look at a population of people that isn't just what campaigns look at, which is consistent voters, but instead look at, say, all registered voters or all adults, it turns out that tons of them care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their #1 priority. And when I say tons, I literally mean tens of millions of them. So why aren't they showing up in polls of likely voters like this? Well, for one pretty simple reason. Environmentalists aren't voting. It turns out that what we've discovered at the Environmental Voter Project is that the environmental movement and the climate movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. It turns out that there are tens of millions of dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who list climate as their very top priority, but they don't show up in these polls and they don't have the attention of politicians for a pretty clear and obvious and understandable reason, and that is they don't vote. And every politician has a list of who votes and who doesn't vote. And for obvious reasons, they don't spend their time worrying about the opinions of non-voters. This is why the Environmental Voter Project is so laser focused on finding environmentalists who don't vote and turning them into better voters. Because it turns out that the size of this population, this group of super environmentalists who don't vote, is enormous. And just to give you some numbers, we identified over 13 million climate first already registered voters who skipped the 2022 midterms. We identified over 8 million who skipped the presidential election in 2020. And again, I just want to be clear, these folks are already registered. They're past that threshold. They're already registered. And like, they care so much about climate, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change, yet they didn't show up and cast a ballot. And I'm going to get into some of the research that we use to come up with these numbers. But this is what I mean when I say the environmental movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. This is a huge, huge pool of voters. And I see some people kind of shaking their heads in frustration. And I get it. I get it. Sometimes I just want to like scream at them and be like, dear God, why aren't you voting? But what I want to suggest to you is that this is also an enormous opportunity. Because we live in a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds, especially about political things or about climate change. But what these people represent right here, these huge numbers, are people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They are with us. They are climate first registered voters. No, they just need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not easy. But it is easier than changing minds. And it's cheaper. And perhaps most importantly, it can be measured because of these public voter files. So you can test messages and actually run randomized control trials, very sophisticated experiments, figuring out what messages do change these people's behavior and turn them into better voters. So I'm going to get into all of that and then get to the Q&A, but I just want one more slide kind of defining the numbers here, the size of this environmental voter turnout problem that I've just presented you with. In that same poll that I showed you earlier, they had split samples where they would ask questions of these voters in battleground states and then look at how likely voters answered the question and compare it to how unlikely voters answered the question, or people who didn't typically vote. And here, what you're looking at is a question that asked people, how important is climate change when choosing a candidate? And you'll see in Nevada, 5% of likely voters said it's the single most important factor when choosing a candidate. 5%. But look down here on the second line. Unlikely voters in Nevada, 10% of them said climate was the top priority when choosing a candidate. Literally twice as many. Twice as many. Look at Pennsylvania, same thing. If you ask likely voters, people who are high propensity voters, 3% of them in Pennsylvania said climate's the single most important factor when choosing a candidate. When you ask low propensity voters, people who almost never vote, more than twice as many said climate's their number one priority. And again, we're not cherry picking this. This is the same story we see over and over and over and over and over again. The climate movement has a huge turnout opportunity here. And I know we're so used to thinking that, okay, the way we grow the climate movement is by persuading more people to care about climate change. And I'm not here to stop you from doing that. That's very important work. But what I am here to tell you is that that's hard, it's messy, it's expensive, and it's really hard to test whether you're succeeding or not. And the truth is, we've got tens of millions of already persuaded environmentalists out there We just need to get to start voting. All right, very briefly, how do we do this? Now, for this part, I am going to breeze through things a little bit because I don't want to presume to know what aspect of our work you're most interested in. That's what the Q&A is for, right? And so I want to get to the Q&A. So if I start breezing over stuff, please know that it's by design, and we can talk about it in more depth during the Q&A. The first thing that we do is identification. We work with data scientists to build what's called predictive models on these voter files. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail in this in the next few slides, but for now, just know what these tools enable us to do is assign individual scores to every voter in a state's voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their #1 priority. And when I say the word we, I mean it in the broadest sense. This is how all sophisticated political campaigns now target voters. No one targets by demographic group anymore. They're all targeting on an individual basis by this, like this. Okay, I'm going to get into more detail on this in a second, but just for now, know what we do is we can individually identify people who are really, really likely to list climate as their #1 priority. And then remember what I said before, whether you vote or not is public record. So once we do that, it's really easy to just say, okay, here are some people who list climate as their top priority, but they're good voters already. They don't need the Environmental Voter Project. They don't need an intervention. And that leaves us with the ones who are low propensity voters. Then we move on to step 2 here, mobilization. We work with thousands of volunteers around the country to canvass and call and send postcards to these voters. We also, as a staff, do direct mail and digital ad campaigns, all using behavioral science-informed messages with just one purpose, and that is to turn these non-voters into brand new voters. And here's the really interesting thing. Because in this first step, we've isolated people who already list climate as their top priority, in step 2, mobilization, we can actually be completely agnostic with our messaging. We don't even need to talk about climate change if we don't want to. Hell, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that's the best way to get these people to vote. Because we already know that they're with us. We already know that whenever they vote for anything from president down to dog catcher, their #1 priority is going to be climate change. And this opens up a whole world of really sophisticated behavioral economics and behavioral sociology experiments that allow us to message directly to these people in a way that's optimized to get them to vote. Step 3, habit reinforcement. You don't need to know a lot about behavioral science in order to be able to guess or intuit that it's really hard to change someone from a non-voter into a habitual voter if you only talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. That's not how you make good habits, right? It's not how you would start exercising more often, right? By going to the gym once every 2 years. And similarly, it's not how you make good voters. And so we take habit reinforcement really seriously. Whenever there is an election, we use it as a behavioral intervention opportunity to build good voting habits. And just to give you a data point on this, last year, in an odd year, when a lot of voter turnout groups weren't doing anything at all, we were active in over 220 different elections. And that's not because all of them were important for environmental policy making. I freely admit that many of them weren't. But what they all were crucially important for was building good voting habits. And our approach at the Environmental Voter Project is, how dare we let an election go by without using it as an opportunity to talk to these people whose voting habits we want to change? Because step 4 is our ultimate goal, and that is changing the electorate. Ultimately, what we want is to dramatically increase the number of environment-first voters, not non-voters, but voters in the states that we work in. Because that is how we get politicians to lead on climate. Ultimately, we are never going to get where we want to be in the climate movement if we are relying on the good nature of politicians to just do the right thing. And I say this as someone who's run literally dozens of campaigns. I don't hate politicians. I think many of them are far more honorable and hardworking than we give them credit for. But I do also know one other thing, and that is nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so they always have to go where the votes are. It's just the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you go where the votes are, or you don't get to be a politician anymore. And so what our job is at the Environmental Voter Project and in the broader climate movement is to dramatically increase the number of climate voters. Because if we can do that, politicians will follow or they're going to be out of a job. All right. Very briefly, I told you I go into a little bit more detail around how we identify these voters, but I do want to keep it brief because I also want to get to our results, how you can get involved, and then to the Q&A. So very, very briefly, the way we identify these voters, and again, this is also what presidential and Senate and gubernatorial and congressional campaigns are doing right now, is we start with enormous polls. We will poll 10, 15, 20,000 people per state. But we can get away with it because we're only asking one question. We're asking people, what's your number one most important political priority? Let's say we poll 10,000 people in Pennsylvania and 1,000 of them say climate's their number one priority. Well, then it's really easy for us to find those people on voter files and start thinking, okay, what do we know about these people? What do we know about these people who just raised their hand and said, yep, climate is my number one priority over all others? What voter file data do we have on them? What census data? What publicly available behavioral or consumer data? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot out there. And maybe we can start seeing hidden patterns and correlations. Like maybe in Pennsylvania, forestry employees are 11 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as their top priority. Or maybe if you have a new home and no kids, you're 6 times as likely as the average Pennsylvanian. Or maybe if you're a gun control supporter, you're 3 times as likely. Or if you subscribe to exercise magazines, you're twice as likely. Now, none of these data points on their own are predictive. But when you start bunching them together, you can identify these clusters of super environmentalists in your data. And more importantly, you can start finding other people like them throughout the Pennsylvania voter file or the California voter file or other states. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we are able to do is literally assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single voter in a state voter file, telling us not how much they care about climate, but literally how likely they are to list it as their number one priority. And I know this sounds like a long, convoluted process, but I think a really good way to understand it is that it's very similar to life insurance. I don't know if you've ever bought life insurance, but if you have, you probably started out by filling out a questionnaire or doing it over the phone, where they asked you about your health history and how much you drink and how much you smoke and whether you dive out of airplanes and things like that. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to build a risk profile for you. But perhaps most importantly, they're not just going to look at your questions and say, okay, let's sell them a policy like, policy X. No, they're going to look for other people like you and figure out how long they lived and build their own predictive model, kind of like what we are doing. Now, they don't call it a predictive model. They call it an actuarial table, but it's very, very similar. And what they need to know, not to be too morbid about it, is how long you're going to live. And if they guess wrong on that, the entire global economy crashes. I mean, this is what the entire insurance industry is based on, right? Well, we're doing the same thing. Only what we're trying to do is identify who are all the people who have a really high likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. And what you're looking at right here is a score distribution of every single registered voter in the state of Pennsylvania. And as you'll see, millions of them have like a less than 30% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. Not a big surprise, right? And then there are a whole bunch in the mushy middle where you can't really be sure. Is it a top priority? No, probably not. But look over here. There are over 1 million who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate and other environmental issues as their top priority. And now for the third time tonight, I will remind you, whether you vote or not is public record. And so once we identify these people who have a really high likelihood of listing climate as a top priority, it's then really easy to just figure out, okay, which of those people don't vote? And as an example, here are the 46,381 registered voters in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, yet we know that they skipped the 2020 presidential election and haven't voted in any election since then. And so we kind of have to assume that they are unlikely to vote this fall. These are our targets. These are the people who we've decided are super environmentalists who just need this behavioral intervention. And not to be too creepy about it, but I do want to remind you, we literally know these people by name and street address. We have phone numbers. It's all on public voter files. And this is how we arm our volunteers with the ability to reach out to super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. And instead of trying to strong arm them into voting for a particular candidate or caring about a particular issue, we just try to get them to the polls using behavioral science-informed messaging. And this is how we're able to do that. All right, I'm going to breeze to the finish because we're running a little late and I want to get to your questions. How we do this mobilization, as I mentioned earlier, we canvass, we call, we postcard, we do digital ads, we do direct mail. If you're interested in the Q&A, I'm happy to go into some of our messaging, but very, very briefly, at the Environmental Voter Project, we almost never talk about climate or environmental issues. Not because we don't like talking about that stuff, but because our experiments show it actually isn't a very good way to turn non-voters into new voters. And so instead, we use little behavioral nudges like peer pressure, letting people know how many of their neighbors turned out to vote. Or we ask people if they intend to vote. And most people will say, yeah, of course I'm going to vote. And then we can follow up with them right before the election and ask them to keep their promise. You know, like little nudges like that can send turnout through the roof. And we're getting amazing results. What we do to measure our impact is we submit our work to what's called randomized control trials. And very briefly, what this means is, let's say, I'll use Pennsylvania as an example again. Let's say we start with a population of 1 million targets in Pennsylvania. So 1 million people who care deeply about climate and the environment, but they're unlikely to vote. Before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into two groups. One is called a treatment group or an intervention group, and the other is a control group. That control group, we never talk to them. It's usually about 15%, and we never, ever talk to them. The remaining 85%, those are the ones we canvass and call and postcard and send digital ads and direct mail to, all with behavioral science-informed messaging. Then the election happens. Now for, I think it's the fourth time I'm going to say, whether you vote or not is public record. And so a few months after the election happens, we can look at public voter files and see how many of the low propensity environmental voters in our treatment group voted and compare it to how many in our control group voted. And as long as these two groups are large enough, and as long as the separation process was truly random, what this then enables us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all other variables. Because even if it was raining in Pittsburgh and that depressed turnout, well, there are proportionately just as many Pittsburgh residents in our control group as our treatment group, so we controlled for that. Or let's say the Biden campaign spends $1 billion turning out voters in Pennsylvania. Well, we've controlled for that. Unless they hack into our system and decide to only target people in our treatment group and not in our control group, we've controlled for stuff like that. And to give you a sense, just over the past 3.5 years, we've been active in about 900 elections. Now, we probably increased turnout in almost all 900 of them, but we can't prove that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout in many of them, because many of them are very small elections. But in some of them, the elections were big enough that we had large enough numbers to run those experiments I was just telling you about. And we were able to prove what our sole impact was on turnout in many of them to a level that's called statistically significant, which means we can eliminate that it was due to random occurrence. And just to give you a sense, in 2020, in 2021, in 2022, in just the first half of 2023, we were able to show in experiment after experiment after experiment that we were solely responsible for boosting turnout as much as 1.8 percentage points in general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5 percentage points in local elections. And these might not seem like big numbers to you, but in politics, they are everything. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal that 1.8 percentage points in Pennsylvania is, and he'll tell you. These are big numbers. Finally, I'll just say, our second metric in measuring our impact is to measure our long-term impact. Since we launched our one state proof of concept now almost a little over 8 years ago, we have communicated with 9.5 million individual low propensity environmental voters. And we track them every time there's an election. And as of this time about 10 months ago, which was the last time we measured, almost 1.5 million of these low propensity environmental voters had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. This is the metric of which we are most proud. Now, I do want to be clear, though. Unlike the previous metric I mentioned, randomized controlled trials, I cannot claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters, because for a whole bunch of reasons, we can't run longitudinal, like multi-year randomized controlled trials. And I'm happy to get into that in the Q&A. But we're pretty darn responsible for turning these 1.5 million into super voters, because I can guarantee you, no one else even was active in 90 elections over the past 3.5 years, let alone 900. All right, we're going to speed to the finish. We're getting lots of favorable coverage from a lot of wonderful places. This year in 2024, we are active in these 19 states that you see here. We have already identified 4.8 million registered voters who are likely to list climate or the environment as their top priority, yet they are unlikely to vote this fall. These are the people we are targeting. Just to give you an idea of the numbers in a few battleground states, we're targeting to almost 230,000 of these low propensity environmental voters in Arizona, almost 500,000 in Georgia. Look at some of these numbers. I mean, the margin of victory in 2020 in Georgia wasn't even 12,000 votes. We have volunteer opportunities all the time. I know this text is really small. I'm putting it up here just to prove a point. I don't expect you to read it. I just expect you to think, oh my gosh, those are a lot of volunteer opportunities. And they are, and they are. And so the final slide before we get to the Q&A is, I ask you to get involved in our work. You have all outed yourselves, okay? You are all here this evening because you care deeply about the climate crisis, or you care deeply about the democracy crisis, or both. And if you want to have an impact this year, I am here to ask you to get involved with our nonprofit and mobilize these voters. If you go to environmentalvoter.org You can see on our Get Involved page, you can sign up for phone banks. We've got multiple phone banks each week. Once you are trained, you can then call on your own whenever you want. We'll give you all the materials. These are easy scripts. You're not twisting anybody's arm to vote a certain way or care about a particular issue. You're just encouraging people to vote. We also will be announcing our next postcarding campaign in about a week or two. And so if you sign up for our email list, also at environmentalvoter.org, you can get notified about that. Although we don't canvass in California where you are, we do canvass in Austin, Tucson, and Pittsburgh. And so if you know people there, you can reach out to them. The second thing is, if you are able, we would love your financial support. We run on donations. We got almost 9,000 individual donations last year, some of them $3, some of them 6 figures, but this is how we make this work. You can make a one-time donation at environmentalvoter.org. You can sign up for recurring monthly donations. What's great about recurring monthly donations is obviously it spreads things out for you, but also for us, because we know that the best way to make a new voter this fall is to get them to vote in their spring and summer primaries and local elections. We work year-round, and literally every day is election day for us. Okay, and you can see our social media handles there. I'm going to stop because I went 5 minutes over and I want to get to Q&A, but thank you for your time. And Brian, or Barry rather, I would love to hear if we've got any questions. Really, really great question. And my guess is that people have forgotten the states that I threw up there, so I'm going to answer it while having this map up here. So we use 3 criteria to choose the states that we are in. The first, and perhaps most important, is we need lots of targets. We work in states that have disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists. We need that because, well, let's use a counterexample. Let's say, I don't know this to be the case, but let's say there are 200 non-voting environmentalists in Idaho. Well, it kind of doesn't matter how good we are. Like, even if we get all 200 of them to vote, that's not going to change anything, right? We need to work in states where if we perform at the way that we know we can perform, our target population is so big that it will end up having a really, really big impact on policymaking. So that's the first criteria. We need lots of targets, lots of non-voting environmentalists. The second criteria is we need lots of elections. There are a bunch of states, for instance, say Oregon, who have gotten rid of all their odd-year elections. Now, they've done it for good public policy reasons. They think, you know what, we can get more people to have their voice heard on who their city councilor is if we have those elections coincide with federal elections. And I kind of agree with that. That's good public policy, but it's bad for those of us who are in the habit-changing business. We want to have as many bites at the apple as possible. And so not only do we want to work in states with lots of targets, but we also want to work in states with lots of elections. And then the third criteria is we don't just care about changing federal policy, we also care about changing state and local policy. All right, so when all 3 of those criteria come together, it means we are in these 19 states. You'll see many of them are purple, but some of them are red, like Alaska, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa. Some of them are blue, Massachusetts, New Mexico. But all of them have a lot of work to do, not just at the federal level, but also the state and local level. There are also some states like, say, Wisconsin or Michigan, which are really, really politically important. But the simple truth is there aren't enough targets for us there for us to make a real difference. And one of the things I am most proud of about the Environmental Voter Project is whenever we talk to a donor, whenever we talk to a volunteer, we can look them in the eye and say, you are delivering a message that we have tested and we know it works. And I can say, we think that we are a really efficient outlet for your financial support and your volunteer time. In a state like Wisconsin, I can't say that. If any of you want to mobilize voters in Wisconsin, God love you because it's really important. But I freely admit, we aren't a really good place for your time and energy. Support other groups. They would do a better job there. But when it comes to the Arizonas and Nevadas and Pennsylvanias and Georgias and North Carolinas of the world, we can hit a home run. And finally, I imagine that many of you are curious about California. California does fit many of those criteria. There's a disproportionately large number of non-voting environmentalists. Although the odd-year elections are few and far between, there are some. And you probably don't need me to tell you, you don't just have a lot of, important elections in congressional federal elections. You've also got some important state and local elections. The problem with California is it is absurdly expensive. And our whole MO at the Environmental Voter Project is we don't want to skip elections. The most important thing when you're trying to change people's voting habits is to always talk to them whenever they have an election, even if it's her library trustee or dog catcher. And to run year-round campaigns every year in California would probably mean we would have to triple our existing budget just to add that one state. So it's a great, great question. Yeah, so great, great question. And so I think there are a few important things to highlight. The first is we know from a lot of academic studies that have been peer-reviewed that politicians are significantly more responsive to the priorities of voters than non-voters. So the first reason why we think it is so important to get these people to vote is that we know it changes policymaking. We just know it. It has been proven over and over and over again. The second thing, and you didn't quite say this, but I think, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, I think another thing that you were perhaps getting at is, if they're infrequent voters, like, do we really trust them to vote the right way? Like, how do we know what they're thinking? And if that's another thing that you were getting at, I think that's a reasonable thing to ask. And I think there are a few important things to realize there. First, we never know what anybody is thinking. Take it from someone who's run dozens of campaigns. Like, I've kept on telling you, whether you vote or not is public record, but who you vote for is secret. Nobody on the Biden campaign knows how any of the people they're turning out are going to vote. Nobody on the Trump campaign knows how the people they're turning out are going to vote. It's secret. You never know. But what we do know about these people are the following things. One, they don't just care about climate and the environment. It is quite literally the number one issue priority in their mind over all other issues. Number one. And so when they go in and they fill out a ballot, that is foremost in their mind in any decision that they make. 2, we know from a whole bunch of public polling that for better or for worse, climate change has become the single most partisan issue, period. Now, we are a nonpartisan organization, but it is very, very clear that people who list climate as their top priority are not confused about how to feel about certain issues and how to feel about certain candidates. You can probably hear that I'm being a little vague in how I say this, and it's by design. We're a nonpartisan organization, but I can say we feel very comfortable in the values that these climate first voters have when we get them to the polls. But it's a very, very good and fair question to ask. I can, yes. Absolutely. So I'm going to give you more than a flavor because, as you probably guessed, we're kind of behavioral science nerds here. So I'm going to tell you what the script is, but first I'm going to give you some of the behavioral science theory behind it. All right. One of the best ways to get somebody to do something is to figure out what societal norms they buy into. You know, what kind of person do they want to be? Or perhaps more importantly, what kind of person do they want to be viewed as? And one of the most powerful societal norms we have is that almost everybody wants to be thought of as an honest promise keeper, right? Like, most people don't want to be thought of as liars. Most people don't want to be thought of as dishonest. So one of the most powerful tools that any behavior change campaign has, whether it's a public health campaign or an electoral campaign, is to get somebody to promise to do something and then reminds them that they made that promise. So what are our phone scripts like? We combine 2 techniques. One is promise keeping, and the other is called plan making. We start off with plan making. Someone will pick up the phone. You'll say, "Hi, I'm Nathaniel from the Environmental Voter Project, a nonpartisan nonprofit. I just wanted to let you know that the gubernatorial election is coming up on Tuesday. Do you plan to vote in person, early, by mail, or not at all?" Now, most people will say that they plan to vote, even though, remember, we're only talking to people who are unlikely to vote. By definition, every single person we're calling is a pretty awful voter, or the Environmental Voter Project wouldn't be going after them. But here's another societal norm. Even people who are awful voters want everybody else to think that they're really good voters. And so you call someone up, you say, "Hey, do you plan to vote on election day or earlier by mail?" And they'll be like, yeah, I'm going to vote early. Thanks, bye. Many of them will hang up. Some of them will ask more questions. And we have this whole script. "Oh, yeah, you want to vote early? Here are the early voting dates. Oh, you have a question about getting a mail ballot? Here it is. Yep, okay." But oftentimes it's a 5-second, 10-second conversation. And that's fine. Because 1, we've gotten someone to start plan making. And we know from a bunch of experiments that when they start thinking about not just doing something, but how they are going to do something, they are more likely to follow through on it. So we've gotten someone to verbalize, "Yes, I'm going to vote and I'll do it early, or I'll do it on election day." But the second thing that we're doing here is that promise keeping thing that I mentioned. When you get someone who is a low propensity voter to say that they're going to vote, it's like a trap closing on them. Because then what we're able to do is call them back up right before the election and say, "Oh, hey, yeah, it's Nathaniel from the Environmental Voter Project. I just wanted to remind you that a few months ago you said that you were going to vote on Tuesday, and we know it's important to you to follow through on your promises. And so Tuesday's your opportunity to do that." And now, instead of me trying to rationally convince someone of the value of their one vote over a denominator of millions, I'm equating the act of voting with whether that person's an honest promise keeper or not. And believe me, that is much, much, much more powerful. And so these are the types of little, almost subtle behavioral nudges, sometimes not so subtle, that we have in our scripts, and they work. But perhaps most importantly for volunteers, just know what you are not doing is saying, trying to convince people to care more about a particular issue or convince people to vote a certain way. Not that that's unimportant. That persuasion messaging is also important. But for what we're doing, it's a really easy ask. And many of our volunteers start a little scared and end up loving it and coming back for more. And that's why we have over 6,000 volunteers. So I don't blame you for thinking that. But the simple truth is we now have, and I encourage you to go to environmentalvoter.org/results. We publish all of our randomized control trials, and we've probably done over 400 of them now. And we have hard scientific evidence showing that these messaging interventions increase turnout while controlling for all outside variables. They do. And the truth is, we're not like mad scientists. It isn't like we're going in a different direction with our messaging than other people are. All of the successful voter turnout messaging relies on a lot of this identity-based messaging working with societal norms. Right. Yeah, no problem. No problem. Really, really great question. So yes, environmentalvoter.org/results. You'll see a lot of reports there, including on both phone calls and postcards. So I'm going to get to your question, but first let me add some nuance, which I know I do a lot, but I think it's important. Oh my God, does the messaging matter? Oh my God, does the messaging matter? It's not as simple as like, do phone calls work? Do postcards work? For instance, like any nonprofit that relies on volunteers, we really like to say yes to volunteers. When volunteers want something, we want to say yes. And as much as it hurt us, for 2 entire years, we told them, nope, we are not doing postcards. And the reason was we hoovered up every randomized control trial we could find, every rigorous scientific experiment, and not a single one of them showed us that postcards were increasing turnout, at least at a statistically significant level. Some said, oh yeah, the people who received our postcards turned out at a higher level, but it wasn't what's called statistically significant. So you couldn't claim that it wasn't due to random occurrence. About a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, we started to see some experiments that showed, yes, if done a particular way with a particular type of messaging, postcards can increase turnout. And so at that point, and only at that point, did we start doing postcarding. But we are very, very careful about the precise messaging and precise design. We are not an organization that says, pick whatever design, pick whatever you want to say, send the postcards. We are the opposite of that. We send you the postcards. We tell you exactly what to write. We also will send you the stamps if you want. We want to have really, really high quality control because even though it's more labor for us, it allows us to always look our volunteers in the eye and say, whenever we ask you to do something, we actually have a study that has proven that it will increase turnout. And so if you go to our website, you will find reports that show particular types of postcard design and messaging do increase turnout. All right, you asked about phone calls. Same thing. Oh my gosh, are there a lot of voter turnout phone call scripts that do not increase turnout? We have had 2 experiments where we've just done phone calls that have shown it does increase turnout if done with this particular script. I don't want to claim that like we have the only script that works. I am confident we don't. But you need to have really, really big phone campaigns in order to get these statistically significant results. And we just haven't tried lots of different scripts. But if you, again, go to environmentalvoter.org/results, you can see that there. Finally, you asked me to compare the 2. I'm going to give you 2 variables rather than 1. You asked about effectiveness, but I think it's also important to think about efficiency. When I say effectiveness, I mean, what is the ceiling at which you can increase turnout with a particular intervention, right? When I talk about efficiency, I mean, okay, how many votes can something create per volunteer hour spent or per dollar spent? With phone calls, they are much more efficient than postcards. You can reach so many more voters so much more quickly that the amount of votes you can create per volunteer hour spent is better, is more efficient than postcards. However, if you forget about the amount of time volunteers spend, and if you forget about cost, and you just say, you've got 100 voters receiving postcards and 100 voters receiving phone calls, which is more effective? The postcards are. But not so much more effective that it overcomes the efficiency of phone calls, if that makes sense. The final thing I'll just say is, every single study I've seen shows you need to have multiple types of interventions when talking to people. Great, great question. So let me answer the second one first. We use a platform that you can use over your computer called a predictive dialer that bypasses 90 to 95% of voicemails and answering machines. And so we won't claim that you won't get some answering machines, but the idea is that the software cycles through numbers until there is a pickup, and it can discern between voicemail and answering machine pickups and human pickups. Now, it doesn't always get it right. It gets it right about 90 to 95% of the time, but there are far, far fewer answering machines. As far as people not being home and things like that, yes, we run multiple rounds of these calls so that we can make sure to get people who we didn't reach the first time, either because they weren't home or because it just rang and rang and rang. And so we definitely do keep doing that. And we also have follow-up scripts. Although I will say, studies have shown, not ours, you need to have like huge phone banking studies where you reach millions of people, but studies have shown that even among people who say, oh yeah, you know, Nathaniel's not home, you end up increasing that person's turnout. And I won't claim that we know what's going on there. Obviously, I don't know what's going on the other side of a phone line. It's probably a lot of people who like are the actual person you're trying to reach and they're just lying. Be like, yeah, Nathaniel's not home. Or they're telling the voter that someone called for them. But what we do know is that if the volume is large enough, even those not homes, you can end up increasing turnout. But the real answer to your question is that predictive dialer that goes over the answering machine. The answer to the first question that you asked about fine-tuning our research, yes, we always, well, I don't want to say always, we are consistently testing new messaging over different communication streams. I backed off always because I want to be clear that, you know, there's a difference between even years and odd years and big elections and small elections. What we will not do in like a battleground state this fall is say, oh, you know, let's not talk to all these people except with this one method so that we can run an experiment. Like, no. Presidential elections are not a time for experimentation. That's what other times are for. And so we end up doing less fresh experimentation with new messaging than we do in primaries or big local elections or during odd years. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Barry, I know you said that was the last question, and so I just want to thank everybody for this wonderful opportunity, for sticking around so long, for your curiosity and your interest in our work. And I really do want to encourage you. I know you're all in the same room together. You're not on Zoom, so you can't like get right on a laptop, but environmentalvoter.org. Go to the website when you get back to your houses and your apartments, environmentalvoter.org. Sign up to volunteer, read some of our studies. I know many of you were curious about those, and sign up to make a donation or a recurring donation, because I promise you, 9 months from now, or 39 Tuesdays from now, when you're sitting on your couch watching election returns roll in, you don't want to have regrets. You want to have gotten involved. And we are an opportunity that wants you to get involved. So please join us.